The AH-64 Apache, America's ultimate attack helicopter with nearly 40 years of battlefield dominance. Used by 19 countries, this beast has been through it all. From blasting Iraqi targets in Desert Storm to protecting ground troops in countless operations. Built tough to survive enemy fire and unleash massive firepower, the Apache has earned its legendary status. But now Russia's Ka-52 Alligator is here to challenge it. Does it really stand a chance against America's battle-tested Apache? Or will the Apache's unmatched firepower, cutting-edge tech, and pure battlefield experience leave the Ka-52 in the dust? Let's dive into what makes the Apache so unstoppable and see how these two helicopters stack up piece by piece. On the surface, both helicopters are roughly the same size. For the AH-64, the gross weight of the plane is approximately 17,600 pounds, while the Ka-52 weighs 21,600 pounds. The external dimensions of the planes are pretty much equivalent. Where the Apache inches past its Russian counterpart is how much ammunition and weapons it can carry. Both planes have roughly the same upper limit at around 23,200 pounds of maximum liftoff weight. This means that under a full weapons load, the Apache can carry roughly 3,000 pounds more than the Kamov, allowing the armies that utilize this helicopter to be more proactive. With that much spare weight to plan around, the AH-64 has much more operational freedom. Furthermore, the aircraft itself is much more maneuverable with a lighter load since it doesn't need to hold as many weapons. Naturally, the Air Forces are typically trained to pilot the helicopter at its full capacity, giving the operator much more experience for real-life situations when the chopper is full. But when the weights are off, the pilots of the AH-64s can perform some admirable stunts, such as full rolls. However, maneuverability is one of the avenues where the Ka-52 does have a slight advantage. The difference here lies in how the helicopter rotors are positioned. The AH-64 utilizes what might be considered a standard four-bladed single rotor on the top and a tail rotor to provide more stability. However, the tail rotor creates counter-torque to the helicopter and can take up as much as 30% of the engine's power to operate. This has the effect of reducing the aircraft's top speed and requires a more complex gearbox, which takes up space and increases maintenance load. On the other hand, the Ka-52 uses two three-bladed contra-rotating top rotors. As the name suggests, the rotors spin opposite one another, creating lift while minimizing the torque created by a single rotor. At the same time, the structure can completely forego the tail rotor, which creates additional stability for the helicopter. It also makes the helicopter's tail less vulnerable to attack. For example, if an Apache's tail rotor is shot, the helicopter's movement can become highly erratic and typically requires it to land immediately. However, a Kamov can pretty much operate without its tail end, albeit with slightly less control. This has been confirmed by video surfacing of the Ka-52s getting their tails blown off, yet still managing to fly and land as if they were unaffected. Additionally, the entire engine and transmission systems are dedicated to the top rotor. They are a comparatively smaller target on the helicopter. This makes the Ka-52 more difficult to hit via ground fire and disabling it altogether. This system does have the disadvantage of adding more weight onto the helicopter, as noted by the respective aircraft's gross weights, which limits how much it can carry. But the Ka-52's total weight doesn't influence it in terms of how fast it can go. The Apache has a top speed of 182 miles per hour, which the Kamov beats with 195 miles per hour. The Kamov also has a slightly higher cruise speed, at around 167 miles per hour. What all this means is that the Kamov is usually more maneuverable than the Apache, potentially giving it an edge in close combat encounters. Mind you, attack helicopters aren't designed for close combat or helicopter versus helicopter fighting, but we'll broach that topic a bit later. Where the Apache does have a slight advantage is its service height ceiling, with a maximum altitude of 20,000 feet compared to the Kamov's 18,000. But does that matter? Not really. Typically, attack helicopters need to fly below enemy radar, hugging the ground and using their higher maneuverability compared to jets to perform vital operations. However, one of the larger advantages that the Apache helicopters can utilize is their higher effective range. Although the actual difference in ranges is relatively small, with the AH-64 having a 300-mile range compared to the Ka-52 having a 280-mile one, this can mean quite a difference in practice. Since the US military has by far the most military bases in the world, the US Army can deploy Apaches to far more territories and operations than the Russian VVS Airspace Force ever could with their Kamovs. But both helicopters are eclipsed by the European Eurocopter Tiger, which has an astounding 500-mile range. But covering long distances isn't all about speed or maneuverability. The Apache AH-64 is also outfitted with a significantly better radar detection system. The APG-78 Longbow, the The radar system used on these choppers can detect and track multiple targets simultaneously. The radar is also integrated into the helicopter's weapons system, where the APG-114L radar-guided missiles use it to track their targets up to 5 miles away from the helicopter. The longbow radar dome is positioned on the mast at the top of the helicopter, allowing the aircraft to hover while staying relatively hidden behind buildings or inside foliage, while the radar system is still able to pick up targets for the missiles to eliminate. At peak efficiency, the radar system can track 128 targets and initiate an attack on up to 16 of them within 30 seconds. By comparison, the Kamov uses a relatively simple Phasertron FH-01 millimeter wave radar, which needs 2 separate antennas for ground and air targets. Additionally, early iterations of the FH-01 show that the system didn't provide full 360-degree coverage around the aircraft and wasn't nearly as effective at tracking targets that were below it. However, it's uncertain how much the FH-01 has progressed over the past few decades, as there are no detailed specifications on the radar's current capabilities. But where the two models of the helicopters truly start diverging are their weapons and defensive systems. And it's likely here that you might notice how effective Apaches are, even after more than 3 decades of use. The hallmark of the AH-64's offensive systems is its 30mm M230 chain gun. While the Kamov also has a 30mm Shipunov 2A42 autocannon mounted onto it, the differences between the two give the AH-64 a significant advantage. First, the M230 is mounted below the helicopter, while the 2A42 is mounted onto the KA52's side. With the M230 on a more maneuverable mount, it allows the pilot or gunner of the AH-64 to more easily track and fire on targets somewhat independently of where the actual chopper is facing. By comparison, the 2A42 only moves slightly up and down or side to side, being semi-rigidly fixed to align with the helicopter's line of sight and close to its center of gravity. This forces the pilot to face the target while operating the autocannon. The 2A42 does have a slight advantage in mid-range accuracy since it's mounted near the helicopter's center of gravity, unlike the free-turning M230 turret mount. However, the improved mid-range accuracy falls apart when you consider the more advanced targeting and tracking systems that the AH-64 has incorporated with the M230. The helicopter's integrated helmet display sighting system, IHADS, think of it like a heads-up display or HUD for first-person shooter games, can connect the M230 to the pilot or gunner's helmets. This means that the gun's turret mount will turn to align with where the master helmet is facing relative to the front of the chopper. It allows the gunner to operate relatively independently of the pilot's flying. In fact, the IHADS used in the AH-64 is the first helmet-mounted display system to be operated by any military in the world, and is likely what propelled the helicopter's efficiency and effectiveness in missions, delivering vital information directly to the crew instead of onto the analog dashboard. But how effective are 30mm rounds? For anti-vehicle combat, the US aerial gunnery standard of performance is to score a direct hit once every 30 rounds on a moving wheeled vehicle at around 1,000 yards away. This seemingly terrible accuracy is still enough to obliterate vehicles and make AH-64s incredibly deadly. For anti-infantry tactics, the effect is even greater. When a 30mm explosive round hits the ground, it creates a 13-foot radius shock blast that can have a devastating effect on enemy personnel. That means that an attack helicopter can create an effective zone of denial for enemy ground forces. Considering that the KA52 typically holds 460 rounds, while the AH-64 typically carries 1,200, the Apache can have significantly larger zoning and anti-infantry capabilities. Apart from its 30mm main cannons, both helicopters are typically outfitted with various missiles, depending on the expected type of operation and enemy encounters. For the AH-64, these can be a combination of 16 Hellfire AGM-114 anti-tank missiles and 76 Hydra 70mm general-purpose air-to-ground unguided rockets. The Apache's anti-air options include the legendary Stinger missiles, identical to the ones used as man-portable anti-air defense systems, or the AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missile. The Stinger man-portable version has been used to great success in the war between Russia and Ukraine, allowing the Ukrainian defenses to consistently deny the much larger Russian air forces to exert air superiority. This shows the potential of an Apache's anti-air system, completely erasing the need to go in close with enemy aircraft. But the Ka-52's offensive capabilities in terms of missiles aren't lagging at all. The aircraft has 2 slots for missiles on each wing, capable of holding a variety of up to 80 80mm general-purpose rockets or 12 anti-tank missiles and 10 122mm S-13 rockets, as well as 2 anti-air Igla systems, which can handily take down helicopters on the end of the wings. The anti-tank missiles fitted onto the Ka-52 typically have a range of roughly 5 miles. The offensive modularity of the KA52 weapon systems, combined with the generally larger number of weapons that the helicopter can carry, makes the Russian design somewhat more deadly when it comes to sheer firepower. The AH-64 compensates for that with typically more advanced weapons, capable of reaching the target at longer ranges or using guided missiles, for which the Russian aircraft and tanks don't have matching defenses. How would these helicopters stack up against one another in close combat? Ideally, they wouldn't. The role of the attack helicopter isn't to attack other helicopters, but to provide support fire for infantry, ground, or transport vehicles. The defenses that attack helicopters have are typically designed for surviving gunfire, not dedicated anti-air missiles such as the Stinger or Igla. Considering the effective range of these missiles is measured in at least a few miles, and the fact that both the AH-64 and the KA52 can carry a complement of them for operations, the chances of helicopters getting within the line of sight of each other are often minuscule. In a hypothetical scenario, the first helicopter to spot an enemy aircraft and have anti-air missiles outfitted as part of its offensive arsenal would win. Considering that the AH-64 has a more advanced radar system, it's more likely to spot incoming enemies and respond quickly. However, the KA52 has 2 dedicated carriage slots for Igla anti-air missiles, while the AH-64 typically uses anti-tank and air-to-ground complements. As such, the US military would have to actively choose between making the Apache more effective against ground forces versus giving them anti-air missiles to use on the off chance they encounter an enemy aircraft. But there's a significant caveat to modern attack helicopters that has been particularly important in the past few years. Attack helicopters have been made increasingly obsolete by modern tactics. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, one of its first offensive missions was to perform a decapitating strike on the Ukrainian government in Kyiv. The operation included 34 helicopters, a combination of transport helicopters and KA-52s that attempted to fly to the Hostomel airport, a few miles outside of Kyiv. During the attack, the helicopters utilized the aforementioned fly-below-the-radar tactics to follow the Dnipro River and avoid military bases between Ukraine and Belarus. Despite that, the Ukrainian defenses spotted the helicopters near the Kyiv hydroelectric power plant and shot down 2 helicopters before the Russian forces could even get to the airport. At the airport itself, the helicopters encountered significant difficulty in repelling a force of only 200 infantry armed with a single anti-air cannon and a few Igla and anti-air manpads. The Russian forces lost 4 more helicopters during the battle for the airport, and the aircraft withdrew as soon as the transported infantry touched down. Considering the relatively low amount of anti-air resistance at the airport and the fact that the KA-52s do have anti-infantry 30mm cannons, it's surprising that the Ukrainian defenses counted relatively few casualties and no deaths among the airport defenders. This shows how ineffective attack helicopters can actually be when pitted against modern, layered anti-air defenses against countries with comparable technologies in their arsenals. For the record, the early iterations of the AH-64 aren't exactly much better. While the helicopters were pivotal in Operation Desert Storm and in the war in Iraq, as well as other international missions between, the Apaches generally stopped being used in offensive operations where they needed to be in direct combat by the early 2010s. This shows that even the US Army was aware that countries with sufficient anti-air missile arsenals would likely create significant difficulties for helicopters that were purely designed for offensive purposes. This caused a marked shift in how the US Army approached their Apache helicopters. By 2011, Boeing had designed a new iteration of the AH-64, dubbed AH-64E. The 64E became the new gold standard for the AH-64 line, effectively replacing the previous fleet fully on missions. What makes the AH-64E so effective in modern warfare compared to the original? The answer is cyber and drone warfare. Unlike the analog systems used so far in the AH-64A first and the AH-64D version, the E version of the helicopters uses an entirely digital information system and improved electronics, which includes radio-transmitted information to the weapon systems. In contrast, the KA-52 still uses the analog system and cable transmitters for the main weapons. But where the AH-64E shines is its incorporation of drone warfare. The helicopter's main weapons and tracking system can integrate seamlessly with military UAVs, drones. With the ability to connect to scout or even seek and destroy drones, the AH-64E shifts from a close to mid-range attack helicopter to a reconnaissance or hunter helicopter. This is due to the possible two-way communication between the helicopter and drones. The drones can uplink their signals to the helicopter, allowing the helicopter to lock onto targets that the drone sees with its own missiles. Alternatively, the helicopter can take full control over the drone's flight or even offensive system. This allows the US Army to deploy a fleet of drones alongside their helicopters and effectively create highly mobile aerial drone control centers that are much more difficult to hit with enemy artillery or missiles. The latter is due to the AH-64 incorporating passive interference for both heat-seeking and radar-guided missiles, as well as more robust armor compared to its Russian counterpart. The advancements in drone warfare were particularly evident in the past few years, as commercial drones became significantly more versatile and powerful. In fact, both Ukraine and Russia turned to commercial drones and retrofitted them with anti-tank mines to transform them into kamikaze drones, creating mobile single-use bombs that could annihilate tanks or other vehicles at a distance while leaving a minimal trail for the enemy to follow. Drone technology improvements are also why Japan, which has a fleet of 12 AH-64s, has outlined that it will replace all of its helicopters with unmanned drones that will focus on scouting and information collection rather than offensive missions. So, limited survivability and long-range missiles potentially make using attack helicopters riskier. That's why the KA52 has a unique trick up its sleeve. It's the first attack helicopter to use ejection seats for its crew. When the helicopter is shot, the ejection system automatically detaches the rotors from the aircraft before ejecting the crew members out of the top of the helicopter. The ejection should work at all speeds and altitudes, drastically improving the odds of survival for the crew, considering the increasing danger they're in on offensive missions. However, the explosive bolts that detach the rotors make it even less likely to scrap or salvage parts of the helicopter if it gets shot down. Where does that leave the modern attack helicopters then? Well, let's consider the sheer scale of how the Apaches and Kamovs are used to determine their effectiveness. As of the time of writing, over 5,000 AH-64s across all versions have been delivered to 19 countries. At the same time, the entire fleet of KA52s numbers under 200 and is operated only by Russia and Egypt. The notion is simple. The world considers the AH-64 more reliable, deadly, and dependable than its supposed Russian counterpart. This has been further supported by the fact that Russia has only had success with its attack helicopters when using them in Syria against an enemy that didn't have comparable anti-air defenses or long-range missiles to counter them. It showcases that despite the apparent technical capabilities such as increased top speed, the AH-64 is still more maneuverable and its weapons complement it more efficiently. Even then, the US military is likely going to start putting away its AH-64s relatively soon, with the almost complete abandonment of the AH-64D versions and replacing them with the drone-operating AH-64E models. The attack helicopter's future is uncertain. With the advent of more effective fighter jets, longer-range missiles, and cost-efficient drones, the attack helicopter's only advantage is their ability to loiter above the target and continuously provide supportive fire. Even then, some drones have been designed to provide loitering capabilities for scouting purposes. Additionally, since AH-64Es can use drones by themselves, they can render most of their close-range offensive complement obsolete. In an ideal scenario, the helicopter will deploy a few drones to serve as forward scouts, relaying the target information back to the helicopter, which is then forwarded to either dedicated long-range launchers elsewhere or used for mounted missiles. This opens the question of where the helicopters slot into a modern operation. With less of a need to mount a short-range offense and provide infantry support fire, the defensive armor of the helicopter is effectively wasted. Since the armor itself is a lot of the helicopter's weight, an attack helicopter being retrofitted into a long-range drone-using scout makes little sense. And the US military knows this. The AH-64s are currently being used as a replacement for the retired OH-58D Kiowa scout helicopters. Their use in the scouting role is situational at best, precisely due to helicopters being too heavy compared to the scout helicopters they had to replace. The sole saving grace of the AH-64E is the fact that it can readily use drones, a feature most other helicopters currently lack, and the one making the AH-64E uniquely suitable for long-range support. The US Navy has also experimented with putting these helicopters aboard ships to be used as aerial complements to traditional ship-versus-ship warfare. This is due to helicopters not needing to be stationed on actual aircraft carriers. Instead, they're able to be deployed from destroyer-class ships as well. Additionally, AH-64s can use nearby military bases or even modified oil platforms for takeoff and landing. Combined with their capability to use drones for increased information gathering and forwarding, the AH-64Es are effectively a mix between an attack helicopter and an aerial scout that could hopefully fight off enemy ships that don't have developed close-range anti-air defenses. The other possible use of helicopters is to have them hover in and out of battlefields to deploy mid-range missiles such as Hellfires or anti-air ordnance against other aircraft. But this makes them increasingly susceptible to layered defenses, as evidenced by how Russia has lost a significant chunk of its helicopters in Ukraine, and why the Russian Air Force only uses about 140 Ka-52s in the first place. A purely offensive helicopter that doesn't have long-range scouting capability simply can't compete in a modern environment, filled to the brim with anti-air defenses or unmanned vehicles. And this is why the AH-64E is superior to the Ka-52. While the helicopters themselves could be considered relics of a bygone age, the Apache has at least managed to keep up with the times. The shift from an attack helicopter to a combination attack scout makes the AH-64 at least usable by modern standards and allows militaries across the world to leverage drone warfare from a mobile aerial base. The Ka-52 simply can't compete. Even with its more robust and capable offenses, no amount of added defense or survival capacity, such as the ejection system, would actually make the helicopter worthy of leading the way to a modern front line. In fact, the AH-64 doesn't have to fly to a front line in the first place, so it will remain relegated to a support role, at least until the next generation of support scout helicopters, ones that fully utilize drones for the bulk of their reconnaissance and offensive tools take flight. At that point, the AH-64E will likely become obsolete itself, and attack helicopters will be relegated to a page in military history. But what do you think? Is there a saving grace for the attack helicopter? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out why the US F-35 would completely destroy the Russian Su-57, or click this other video instead.